Good morning, gamers, and welcome to my Samurai guide for Dawntrail. I'd like to first go over what this guide is and what this guide is not. This guide is for Samurai players of any and all skill levels, whether you're just picking up the job or you're a parse pill juicer. And it'll cover all the necessary tools for you to become successful and effective at playing the job. This guide is tailored towards standard single target encounters at level 100, and it will not cover abilities and concepts below level 100, nor will it go into detail on AoE. I do have a written guide with most of the information that I'm about to cover, as well as individual descriptions and details on specific abilities, which will be in the description of this video. While this video is not 100% verbatim of the document, please feel free to use the Word document to kind of follow along as we work through the various sections and details, because there will be examples pulled from the written guide. We're going to start by going over the core concepts, then we'll jump into the standard opener and burst windows before finally diving into some further optimization options for you to utilize. The expectation is to give you building blocks to piece together a foundation that we will tie together at the end and expand upon. Now, this is a very long video, so while I would love you to watch all of it, I understand it's a pretty big time investment and, well, it's a lot. So I will have timestamps throughout to allow you to jump around and cater to your interests, so feel free to look in the description for various timestamps. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below or reach out to me in Discord or drop by one of my Twitch streams. So with that out of the way, let's start from the beginning. Samurai is a melee job with no raid buff to provide for their party. However, their damage cooldowns make up for the lack thereof, and they ultimately provide utility through the means of their damage. With reliable, strong burst windows, a low barrier to entry, and a high skill ceiling, Samurai offers a fun and enjoyable playstyle for any skill level of player. On the surface, Samurai is a builder and spender job with 3 different resources: Sen, Kenki, and Meditation. Sen is Samurai's primary resource and is spent on hard-hitting finisher abilities. We build Sen by using one of our 3 primary global cooldowns, or GCD finishers. Those 3 GCDs are Yukikaze, Gecko, and Kasha. Yukikaze gives Setsu, which is the Snow Sen. Gecko gives Getsu, which is the Moon Sen. And Kasha gives Ka, which is the Flower Sen. While there are 3 different types of Sen, they can individually be thought of as a prerequisite for using a final finisher combo, which is spent on an ability called Iaijutsu. Iaijutsu is an ability which changes into a new weapon skill depending on how many Sen the Samurai has stored. This ability can be used after obtaining 1, 2, or 3 different types of Sen, with each corresponding amount giving us access to a different weapon skill. At 0 Sen, our Iaijutsu ability is unusable, and it appears like this, as there's no resource for it to consume. At 1 Sen, our Iaijutsu is converted into Higenbana, which is our main damage over time ability, or DOT for short. This is something that we want to maintain and apply every minute. At 2 Sen, our Iaijutsu is converted to Tenkagoken. This is primarily used on 3 or more targets in AoE situations. And finally, at 3 Sen, our Iaijutsu is converted to Madari Setsugeka, our primary single target damage spender. Kenki is our second primary resource that we have, and it is spent on the abilities Hisatsu Shinten, Hisatsu Sene, Zanshin, Hisatsu Yoten, Hisatsu Kyuten, and Hisatsu Gyuren. So Shinten, Sene, and Zanshin will be our main abilities that we use our Kenki on, as these are the spenders we will use in single target, which is what this guide is catered towards. Our final resource is Meditation, and it's pretty straightforward. Every time you use an Iaijutsu like Madari Setsugeka or Higenbana, you generate 1 stack of Meditation, which is represented by the 3 diamonds under your Kenki gauge. And once you have 3 stacks of Meditation, you can use an ability called Shoha to consume all your Meditation stacks to deal a brunt damage to your primary target, and split damage to all enemies in a straight line. Aside from our resources, we have a couple of buffs and cooldowns that we must maintain and pay attention to. Starting with the 2 personal buffs that we want to keep up at all times. The first is Fugetsu. This is a buff that gives us a 13% flat damage increase for 40 seconds, and it is refreshed by using Jinpu or Gecko. This buff will usually be maintained naturally by following a standard rotation and will usually only fall off during downtime or broken GCD combos. The second buff that we must maintain is Fuka. This is a buff that gives us a 13% reduction in our GCD recast and our auto attack delay for 40 seconds. Or in other words, it makes you able to hit your buttons faster. Like Fugetsu, Fuka should be naturally aligned by following a standard rotation, but Fuka is refreshed by using Shifu or Kasha. Both buffs, Fugetsu and Fuka, can be refreshed through the means of the first cooldown we're going to talk about, Miekyo. As of Dawntrail, Miekyo has its eggs in a lot of different baskets, but we're going to try to break them down so that we understand all of what's going on. Miekyo's primary purpose is to allow us to use 3 combo finishers and generate their corresponding sen without having to go through a full combo sequence. So instead of having to do Hikaze Jinpu Gekko, if you have the Miekyo buff, you can just press Gekko. And you will not only get a Getsu sen from doing that, you will also refresh your Fugetsu buff. Miekyo has 2 charges, and we utilize Miekyo to not only get our personal buffs rolling in the opener, hence the tie to Fugetsu and Fuka, but Miekyo is also used as a damage cooldown roughly every minute. Upon the use of Miekyo, we'll also gain 2 additional buffs alongside our Miekyo buff. Those 2 buffs are Tsubame Gaishi Ready and Tendo. Tsubame Gaishi Ready gives us access to use the ability Tsubame Gaishi, while Tendo turns Tenka Goken and Madari Setsugeka into higher potency Tendo versions of themselves. Now just a quick note on that, there is no Tendo Higanbana, so keep that in mind for later parts of this video. Tsubame Gaishi is an ability that can only be used when you have the Tsubame Gaishi Ready buff that you get from Miekyo. Tsubame Gaishi itself mimics your previous Ei Jutsu cast. So for example, if your Ei Jutsu cast is Madari Setsugeka, then your Tsubame Gaishi will turn into Kaishi Setsugeka. This Kaishi Setsugeka is the mimicked ability, and it must be used immediately after your Madari Setsugeka cast, or you will lose the Tsubame Gaishi Ready buff upon the use of a separate GCD. So let's talk about Miekyo's final egg in the basket. I don't know. Tendo. Tendo is a new personal buff in Dawntrail that will only be granted to the player after Miekyo is used, similar to Tsubame Gaishi Ready. Once Miekyo is used, Madari Setsugeka, our single target Ei Jutsu, will be converted into Tendo Setsugeka, and upon use, Tsubame Gaishi will mimic Tendo Setsugeka by turning into Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka. So that was a lot about Miekyo, and if you're thinking, hey, this is ridiculous, why is this one ability so convoluted? I agree with you, and it's dumb. But it's what we have to work with right now, so understanding all of its dependencies is very important. And I wanted to break them down one by one for you so that it's easier to piece things together. In short, if you press Miekyo, 3 things are certain in single target. 1, you're going to be using Tendo Setsugeka. 2, the GCD after your Tendo Setsugeka must be your Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka to consume your Tsubame Gaishi Ready buff. Otherwise, if you don't press Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka after your Tendo Setsugeka, you're missing out on a ton of damage. And 3, you want to prioritize using your Miekyo buff stacks on Gekko and Kasha, as these are the higher potency finishers of your 3 finisher GCDs. As you'll see later in the video, while Miekyo's primary purpose is to be spent on 3 combo finishers like Gekko and Kasha, we end up using all of its properties to ensure that every Miekyo use has a purpose. Ikki Shoten is a 2-minute cooldown that gives us 50 Kenki, grants us access to a new high potency off global or OGCD cooldown called Zanshin, and grants us access to a high potency global cooldown or GCD, Ogi Namakiri. Upon the use of Ikki Shoten, we'll receive 2 buffs called Zanshin Ready and Ogi Namakiri Ready, which allows us to use Zanshin and Ogi Namakiri respectively. Therefore, Ikki Shoten's kind of similar to Miekyo in a way, since it unlocks other high potency abilities. And in Ikki Shoten's case, that's Ogi Namakiri, Kaishi Namakiri, and Zanshin. And like Miekyo, we want to carefully consider how and when we use Ikki Shoten around our burst windows. Since Zanshin, the OGCD we unlock upon the use of Ikki Shoten, costs 50 Kenki to use, Ikki Shoten ends up being a Kenki neutral ability. As Ikki Shoten itself provides 50 Kenki, Zanshin then consumes the 50 Kenki, and thus both of these should be utilized inside of raid buffs after Kenki has been depleted to 50 or less. There will be more about optimizing all these cooldowns in following sections of this video. Again, I'm just kind of laying the stepping stones for you. All right, so I know this was a lot, but we're only just getting started. So if you made it this far, first off, thank you. And I'm proud of you. But also, this is the part of the guide where we will start piecing together the core concepts. And then even later, we'll piece together these individual parts of the rotation that we're going to discuss. So let's move on to what I guess we can call phase 2 of this guide. I don't know. We'll go through the standard opener, our standard bursts, and then we'll tie it all together by teaching you how to integrate these sequences. So this image is the standard opener. Every ability at the bottom is a global cooldown or GCD, and every ability that is raised up or weaved between the GCDs is called an off global cooldown or OGCD. And our opener is crafted in a way to ensure we utilize all the core concepts we've been explaining previously. So let's really dive into what's going on here and how it all works together. The first thing going on happens before we even pull the boss, as we're trying to get our Miekyo on cooldown as soon as possible. Since we can use Miekyo out of combat, and the Miekyo buff itself, as well as all the other buffs it gives you, have 20-second durations, we can use Miekyo 14 seconds before we need to initiate. This allows us to use our 3 finisher GCDs while making sure we have enough time before the buff falls off. Another thing you'll notice is we're also going to use a True North before we engage, as this will ensure we land both of our positionals from Gecko and Kasha, which are the first 2 GCDs in this sequence, while the boss is being pulled or maneuvered. Gecko is used first to get our damage buff rolling and generate a Getsu Sen, while Kasha is used after to get our speed buff rolling and generate a Ka Sen. And between these first 2 GCDs, we'll use our potion after Gecko and then our Iki Shoten after Kasha. This is to make sure our pot catches as much potency as possible and to get the cooldown timer running on our Iki Shoten as we prepare for entering our first burst window. We then use the final charge of our Miekyo on Yukikaze to generate the final sen necessary so that we can cast Setsugeka. Now, this will be where our opener preparation ends, and the opener itself really starts, as this is the point in the fight where our first set of raid buffs will usually go out. And while this is a Setsugeka cast, we have to remember we have our Tendo buff from Miekyo, so this will actually be a Tendo Setsugeka cast, and it must be followed up by a Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka to consume our Tsubame Gaishi Ready buff from Miekyo. Between the cast for Tendo Setsugeka and Kaishi Setsugeka, we're going to use Sene to make sure we get Sene on cooldown as soon as possible, so we can avoid drifting or delaying it throughout the fight. After the Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka, we're going to use our second charge of Miekyo to give us access to 3 more finisher combos to quickly generate Sen for our Higambana dot that we'll be reapplying and maintaining on our target. Here, or somewhere between these GCDs, we can use the OGCD Zanshin that we got from our Iki Shoten to consume our Zanshin Ready buff. Zanshin isn't really as time sensitive as abilities like Sene and Iki Shoten, so just use it where you feel most comfortable as long as it's still in raid buffs. And of course, make sure you're still rolling your GCD. After the Higambana cast, we'll use our Ogi Namakiri that we got from our Iki Shoten. This will consume our Ogi Namakiri Ready buff, and then convert our Ogi Namakiri button into Kaishi Namakiri, which we must and will use immediately after. Between these 2 globals, we can utilize our first cast of our OGCD, Shoha, as this is the point where we will have used 2 different EI jutsus in the form of Tendo Setsugeka and Higambana. Since we will also have used Ogi Namakiri by this point, we'll have an additional meditation stack for a total of 3, as the 2 AI jutsus that we use will each give us 1 meditation stack for a total of 2, and the Ogi Namakiri that we use also grants us a meditation stack, for a total of 3 meditation stacks to be used on Shoha. After Kaishi Namakiri, we will spend the remaining 2 stacks of our Miekyo buff on Kasha and Gecko. This is coming from our second use of Miekyo, and we will still have our Tendo and Tsubame Gaishi Ready buffs from this use as well. We'll then proceed to finish building our last sen necessary to cast the Setsugeka by the means of using a normal Yukikaze sequence, or in other words, Yofu then Yukikaze, and this will generate the sen Setsu. And since we will already have a Getsu Sen and a Ka Sen from our Miekyo usage on Gecko and Kasha, we can follow up on our Yukikaze use with Tendo Setsugeka to consume all 3 Sen. This will also consume our Tendo buff, then enable us to use Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka to consume our Tsubame Gaishi Ready buff, all while spending our remaining Kenki before our pot window ends to ensure we have utilized as much potency as possible in our opener. The opener for Samurai is a very important foundation for Samurai of all skill levels to understand, as it is used in most, if not all, circumstances, and it is the most efficient method for applying self-buffs and initiating burst sequences. So let's go over the burst sequences that we will use as Samurai players. One of the most important steps to learning Samurai and playing optimally is understanding and gaining confidence with the execution of our burst windows. With raid buffs being extended to 20 seconds in Dawntrail, this gives us a bit more time to fit extra potency in these buffs. So we have 2 versions of our burst. The odd burst, which is usually catered towards astrologian card buffs and is in reference to the 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minutes, and so on time points. And then we have the even burst, which is set up for primary raid buff alignment at even time intervals of on pull or 0 minutes, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 6 minutes, and so on. So starting with the odd burst, this is the burst window that happens every odd minute or is better identified as its absence of 2-minute cooldowns. We have some things coming off a cooldown like Sine. Some of our Miekyo charges are starting to come back. And this is essentially an opportunity for us to kind of cram as much potency into a small little window so we can catch some astrologian cards or something. But mainly it's a window for us to reapply our Higginbana dot. So generally every odd minute burst window should consist of 1 Miekyo, 1 Tendo Madari Setsugeka, 1 Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka, 1 Higginbana, 1 Madari Setsugeka, 1 Sene, 1 Shoha, and 4 to 5 Shintens. So let's look at an example. This is an example of your typical odd burst window. The key things to pay attention to here, aside from our 1 minute grocery list that we just discussed, are where Miekyo is being used, what GCDs Miekyo is being used on, where Sene is being used, how many Shintens we are using, and what GCD Higginbana is consuming, which we will get into later. But I still want you to just notice that a little bit. I'm not going to deep dive into the odd minute window like we did with the opener, but again, keep the things we just went over in mind as we look at some other examples. The next example starts the odd minute burst window with a regular Madari Setsugeka cast and uses Miekyo after the Madari Setsugeka. This puts us in an early spot in the odd minute window to reapply Higginbana. And it also backloads the burst with Tendo Setsugeka and Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka. This example could be used in a situation where you want to get Higginbana out 1 GCD earlier, or if there's some scenario where you need to backload your 1 minute burst to catch an Astro card. The final example is used in more niche environments, but it's something you may see in more highly optimized scenarios. Now I want to pause here and say that just because something is used in highly optimized scenarios does not mean it's best applied to all scenarios. And this is not an odd burst example that I would recommend following unless you have a firm understanding of what you're doing and what it affects. And to emphasize even more, the first and second examples are also used in very highly optimized scenarios. But again, this is just an example and I just want to talk through what's going on here as this is an option that you have for your 1 minute window. Notice where we're using Miekyo here. We're still following the same concepts of how to approach the 1 minute window by hitting all the proper GCDs that we would like. But the main difference here is what finisher combo is being utilized or consumed by Higginbana. This example uses Yukikaze to consume the sen that would normally be spent on Higginbana. This gives us an opportunity to backload this specific odd burst window with potency as well as accelerate our rotation at the next burst window forward. This GCD acceleration that we call it occurs because we only consume 2 GCDs on Higginbana from the Yofu Yukikaze combo, instead of the normal 3 GCDs that we would consume by using Higginbana on Gecko. The 3 GCD combo, Gecko or Kasha, that we would consume in a standard odd burst window is now being replaced by a 2 GCD combo Yukikaze, thus accelerating our rotation forward by 1 GCD by the time we reach our next burst window. We'll go into more details about how we can accelerate and manipulate the pacing of our rotation later, but again, this example is just here to get that idea kind of working in your mind for the time being. I still do recommend focusing on the first example that we went through, as that is the typical and primary odd burst window. So let's move on to the even burst. This is a burst window that occurs every even minute, or a window that has all of our 2-minute cooldowns available and should overlap with the rest of our party's raid buffs. The even minute burst is kind of like our odd burst, but it's significantly stronger as we'll be bursting with 20-second raid buffs. We'll have Ikki Shoden, Ogi and Kaishi Namakuri. We'll also have Zanshin available to us. So generally every even burst window should consist of Tendo Setsugeka, Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka, Higginbana, Ogi Namakuri, Kaishi Namakuri, and if possible, 3 to 4 high potency finisher combos like Gecko and Kasha for a total of 9 GCDs that will overlap with raid buffs. So let's take a look at the standard even burst window example. Right off the bat, it may look pretty familiar, and if you're not catching my drift, let's look at this example next to our standard opener. Notice how GCDs number 2 through 11 in this even burst example are identical to the GCDs 4 through 13 in the standard opener example. Just like the opener, this window has access to all of our cooldowns, but it also has access to a lot more. So here are the main things I want you to pay attention to with the even minute burst window and this example specifically. The first is what we discussed about the GCDs and how they're set up to be executed like the opener. This is not only for your muscle memory, but it's also for the same reasons the opener is set up the way that it is. That being that this is the most efficient and effective way to initiate our burst sequences and utilize our damage and raid buffs. We should very reliably be able to land 9 global cooldowns inside of 20-second raid buffs at a standard 2.14 or 2.15 GCD speed. Thus, in an ideal scenario, buffs would go out to catch the last finisher that generates us 3 sen from our cooldown phase before our burst. Or in this example, this Gecko. And then the buff should last until the last 3 GCD combo of our Miekyo, which in this example is this Kasha. So when we talk about a real 2-minute window, this is the window that we're talking about. These are the 9 GCDs that we want to overlap with raid buffs. And these are the 9 GCDs that we are talking about when we refer to what our even burst should consist of. As we'll learn later in this video, it is important to do our best to align our even minute burst windows in this manner with raid buffs so that we optimize overall damage output as much as possible. This not only increases our own damage, but also our party's damage, which directly translates to the boss dying faster, your healers having to do less, you getting out of the raid quicker, and rolling a 2 on whatever piece drops in the raid. But overall, raid buffs are very important and should always be something that you as a samurai pay attention to and coordinate with. The second thing that we should notice and pay attention to in the even burst is our cooldowns. Again, this window is extremely reliant upon utilizing our cooldowns to do as much damage. And as such, we should plan accordingly to make sure these align properly without making us lose a use over the course of a fight. Notice where Ikki Shoten and Sene are being used. Notice how similar the GCD placement of Namakiri and Tendo Setsugeka are. The third and last thing we should pay attention to, but definitely not the least of importance, is our resources, Kenki and meditation. The reason Ikki Shoten is used where it is because the Kenki we want to enter the 2-minute window with is, well, literally as much Kenki as possible. With the cap of Kenki being 100, that means in an ideal world we will have 100 Kenki upon the start of our burst or when raid buffs go out. And since Ikki Shoten gives us 50 Kenki upon use, using Ikki Shoten at the start of our even minute burst window would result in us overcapping on Kenki. Overcapping Kenki is something that we should never do and avoid at all possible costs, as every single point of Kenki we burn is 10 potency, or potential potency, I guess. So for overcapping by 50 Kenki, we would be losing potentially 500 potency of potential Kenki spenders, which directly translates to losing 2 Shenten casts. Ikki Shoten is also used here because while we're avoiding overcapping our Kenki, we still need to get it on cooldown so that we don't lose a use over the course of a fight and so that we can make sure to get our Ogi Namakiri and Kaishi Namakiri, as well as Zanshin in raid buffs. Similarly to the opener in the odd window, Sene is being used as soon as possible in raid buffs to keep it on cooldown and to make sure it's not drifting. And then the rest of our Kenki is spent on our primary OGCD spenders, Shenten and Yoten. Now, before we finish discussing the burst sections, I just want to dive a little deeper into the Kenki maintenance, as I tried to primarily focus the previous sections around our GCDs, as I believe that's the most important part for new players to focus on first, but that is not at all to undermine the importance of Kenki maintenance. As you've seen throughout our rotation, we'll be building resources and spending Kenki as we need. Optimally, it's going to be best if we pull our Kenki as high as possible without overcapping for buff windows, just like we discussed, and then dumping as many Shentens as weave space and resources provide while making sure we have enough Kenki to keep Sene on cooldown, and make sure we're using Zanshin inside of raid buffs. You've probably also noticed the use of Yoten in some of these examples. Yoten is here to deplete your Kenki as much as possible when you will not be getting another Shenten under raid buffs. Or if you want to only burn 10 Kenki instead of 25 Kenki on a Shenten, as to make sure you don't overcap before burst windows. Shenten and Yoten are interchangeable as they're the same potency per Kenki, but you primarily want to focus on using Shenten over Yoten to consume as much potency as possible in both your even and your odd bursts. So we're finally at the section that ties everything together. While this isn't the last section of this guide, I have no idea how long this thing's going to keep going on. This is probably the most important section, as it really helps us put together our foundation upon the building blocks we've been discussing up until this point. Earlier, we showed you the standard opener, then we talked about the odd burst, and finally 2-minute window. And I structured this video such that we essentially drew an outline for our overall picture, and now we're going to color it all in. Samurai's rotation can be simplified, yet still extremely effective by performing a cyclical rotation that is often referred to in the community as a loop. Now the loop is nothing new, it's the same thing we've been doing since, I don't know, before I started playing Final Fantasy. But the loop for Samurai is a great place to build a fundamental understanding for playing the job, and it's a key concept for all Samurai players regardless of skill level. The loop can be thought of as a series or a flowchart that looks like this, the simple full loop. This is a visualization of the standard full loop cycle and can be broken down into 7 different steps. And these steps show how we will piece together the earlier concepts covered in this video. The first step is the opener. This is your standard opener that we saw earlier. Once our opener is completely finished, we then enter our cooldown phase. Now I waited to discuss the cooldown phase until this section because I think you guys might be able to grasp it pretty quickly. But the cooldown phase is just a phase that rotates through our standard GCD combos in order to generate Sen and spend them on Madari Setsugeka. And at the end of the cooldown phase, it should put you in a position to begin your next burst window with Madari Setsugeka. Or in other words, you should exit your cooldown phase with 3 Sen. Now we'll dive a little bit more into this in a second. So if you're not getting it right now, just stick with me, we'll get there. But once we exit our cooldown phase, then we enter our odd minute burst. This is going to be the same standard example number 1 odd minute burst that we saw earlier. And then once the odd minute burst finishes, then we go back into our cooldown phase. However, this time we will add a filler. Filler is something we have the option of adding outside of our burst windows so that we can make sure to properly align with raid buffs. It's typically used before even minute burst windows like it's shown here in the standard loop, and at a standard GCD speed of 2.14 or 2.15, the same one we've been using throughout the whole document. We will perform what's called a 2 GCD Yukikaze filler. All this means is that after exiting our odd minute burst window and prior to entering our even minute burst window, we want to use Yofu and Yukikaze while we have 0 Sen, and then use Hagakure to consume those Sen. This will delay our rotation by 2 global cooldowns, but it will make sure that our next burst at the even minute window aligns properly. We do this to not only stay in sync with raid buffs, but also to keep as much uptime on our dot Higginbana as possible, since delaying our even minute burst by 2 GCDs allows us to refresh Higginbana on time, or as it falls off. Once we've performed the necessary filler for our skill speed, we'll then build back up the 3 Sen necessary to enter our next even minute burst with a Setsugeka, and then we'll execute our standard even burst. Once our even burst is finished, we go back into our cooldown phase where we again begin our standard GCD combos to build Sen while not duplicating or overcapping any of our resources. However, our cooldown phase this time has no filler. And if you need a mental cue as to where your cooldown phase ends or how to keep track of it, there should be 1 Madari Setsugeka between each burst window, not counting the Madari you will get at the end of each burst window from the GCDs contributed by your Miekyo. Or in other words, the Madari that's been showing up at the end of all of the burst window examples. Again, your cooldown phase will look something like this. Notice, at the start of this burst window is the Madari from the previous example being consumed, so we're entering this example with 0 Sen. This is our fresh cooldown phase. We build up to 1 Madari in the middle, we use the Madari, and then we build up enough Sen again to enter our next burst window. Once we finish our cooldown phase and have prepped our Sen and our other resources for the next burst window, we then repeat this cycle from the odd burst. And we cycle through this loop until the boss is dead. And to emphasize, this is just focusing on the GCDs, which is why it's extremely important, especially if you're just starting out, to focus on getting your globals correct and understanding how they affect the timings of the rest of your rotation prior to focusing on the rest of your optimization. So that's an overview of how you perform and execute a standard loop. I do have a VOD of me performing the standard loop in the video description, so if you'd like to really break it down and take it global by global, that will be there to use as a reference, as well as the visual breakdown and the written guide, which dives into more details about utilizing other GCD speeds. It goes into more information about filler, and it also talks about the cooldown phase. So everything we've talked about up until this point in the video is what I believe to be the foundation of playing Samurai. And everything up until this point should give you the tools to be successful, competitive, and effective at the job. So it's really important that you truly understand what is going on up until this point before continuing on with the following sections in this video. The next thing we're going to talk about is downtime. Dawntrail is looking like it's going to be a pretty punishing expansion for Melee, especially for those used to Endwalker. The hitboxes are looking like they're going to be smaller, and from the mechanics we've seen so far, it's going to be some pretty interesting or involved methods to maintain full uptime. So I want to start by talking about short downtime first. Short downtime is where we're unable to continue to roll our GCD or hit the boss, and we must utilize tools like NP, or at the absolute worst case, eat the downtime and cast nothing. I would consider this any period of downtime long enough not to cast our ability Meditate without generating resource. So how do we handle it? Well, you just press U, leave duty. During short downtime, we should prioritize trying to continue to roll our GCD by utilizing our ranged GCD NP. Ideally, we can prep ourselves enough to be in a position to prep our combo for NP by using 10 Kenki on our OGCD Yaten prior to the downtime, and this would ultimately result in us losing one global cooldown. Or from an alternative perspective, performing a 1 GCD filler, and then continuing our rotation per usual with that understanding in mind. This is where having a good understanding of the fundamentals can come into play. Let's say you know you're going to lose 1 GCD of downtime between your odd burst and even burst. This means you're going to be using 1 NP somewhere in your cooldown phase. But remember, we need to use 2 GCDs of filler at our standard GCD speed at 2.14 between our odd and even minute burst windows. So if we understand that fundamental, we now know that we only need to do 1 GCD of filler instead of our standard 2 GCD Yukikaze Hagakure. As the quote-unquote downtime filler that we used an NP on would count as one of the 2 GCDs required. This would result in us purposefully using another NP GCD filler prior to entering our next even minute burst window to maintain alignment and continue our loop. And if hypothetically that 1 GCD of downtime was all that we had in a fight, or in other words there's no other downtime throughout the fight, then once we exit our even minute burst window, we can continue the standard loop. And the next filler we would use again would be the 2 GCD Yukikaze Hagakure that would occur after the next odd minute window. So what would have happened in our hypothetical scenario if the 1 GCD of downtime happened prior to the odd burst instead of prior to the even burst, where we're supposed to have no filler? This is where we can start getting into more further optimization techniques, which we're going to cover in this next section about GCD acceleration. Now I know acceleration is like a buzzword, so is ad hoc. But basically all we're doing is understanding how every global that we press affects the rest of our rotation. Let's take this image for example, and shout out to Flare for providing this. I appreciate that a lot. These are 3 examples of the odd minute burst that we saw earlier, just kind of extended a little bit further to their next Madari cast. Again, just a quick note, and I'll mark it here on the screen. These locations are where your cooldown phase starts. So looking at the standard odd example, we see our Higginbana goes out 3 GCDs after the first Setsugekko cast. Similarly, the Yukikaze Higginbana example also applies Higginbana 3 GCDs after the first Madari cast. Both of these odd minute windows apply Higginbana at the same time. However, you'll notice that the Madari in the cooldown phase is 1 GCD behind that of the Yukibana acceleration. This is what we were talking about earlier, where Gecko is technically a 3 GCD combo, and using Higginbana to consume a Gecko Sin will end up acting as a filler of a sorts, I guess you could call it, when you compare to a Yukikaze combo. Because in order for you to generate a Gecko Sen, you must use Yofu, Jinpu, then Gecko. And in order to generate a Yukikaze Sen, you must use Yofu, then Yukikaze. And that 1 GCD difference is what we are seeing down the line here. And those GCDs must be made up somewhere, and that happens before the Madari and the cooldown phase. Similar to our standard odd window, the second example that we saw earlier also has its Madari Setsugekka in the cooldown phase at the same spot. But you'll notice that its Higginbana is 1 GCD earlier. This is because we're using Miyakyo after the Madare, thus removing the Kaishi Setsugekka that would have been where the Gecko is in this example, to use Higginbana earlier. So in that hypothetical scenario earlier that we were talking about, where we have 1 GCD of downtime before the odd minute burst window, this odd minute burst example would be a great way to reapply your Higginbana on time. However, you still need to keep in mind that you're adding 1 GCD to this sequence. So your next filler before the even minute window will only need to be 1 GCD. And therefore our scenario of 1 GCD of downtime prior to the odd burst would only result in us having to use an NP somewhere between our odd minute burst window and our even minute burst window for our filler. And these same methodologies can be applied anywhere in your rotation. But we've kind of lost a lot of this flexibility going into Dawntrail, because before we could use Miekyo to do things like quickly accelerate our burst and have a quick short combo sequence. Or we could do a sequence like this, where we have 2 Sen built up, and use Miekyo to generate the final Sen needed to cast Tendo Setsugeka, and rush our sequence forward again. Now, the important thing to notice in these sequences are the total GCDs needed to reach the Setsugeka cast, as well as what GCDs each sequence ends on, and most importantly, what GCDs are being accelerated by Miekyo. Sequence 2 and 3 both use Miekyo to enter burst faster by manipulating GCD slots in our rotation. This technique is commonly referred to as Miekyo acceleration, and it just refers to using Miekyo to skip the combo GCDs needed to execute fillers. Now, while Miekyo acceleration is an important tool at your disposal, it's even more important to understand that an early use of Miekyo is usually utilized to bring forward a Tendo Setsugeka cast immediately, or as fast as possible. And this will result in the following Madare cast being the same amount of GCDs. So to prevent yourself from using a Tendo Setsugeka cast early outside of raid buffs, you can use one of your combo sequences as filler to delay your early Tendo to align with more buffs. The other variant of using this Miekyo acceleration technique is used in the scenario when your GCD sequence is behind where burst should be happening. This again is another way that we can deal with downtime, and it's also exactly what we're doing in our opener and what we do when we come out of long periods of downtime. Now, I know we talked about downtime earlier, and this video is like 5 hours long, but now that we have an idea of how to manipulate our rotation, I want to briefly touch on large periods of downtime, or moments when you can't hit anything for a substantial amount of time. In an ideal world, we enter downtime with a Setsu Sen from Yukikaze, and position ourselves to be able to reopen after the downtime with a Miekyo, so that we can get our buffs reapplied with Gecko and Kasha. This will allow us to exit the downtime with a Tendo Setsugeka, Tendo Kaishi Setsugeka, and then we can use the remaining stack of our Miekyo to gain 1 more Sen and reapply Higenbana. The ideal scenario would look something like the following. Now, while this scenario is ideal, it's not always going to line up like this. Therefore, we need to make sure to understand why we're doing what we're doing in the first place. So I've got a little checklist that you can use to determine how you should handle different lengths of downtime for your specific scenario. The first being, determine what GCD you're going to enter the downtime on and try to make sure you're ending on a combo finisher. This will give you the opportunity to not waste any GCDs and at least gain another Sen. If you have 3 or more seconds of downtime where you're able to stand still or plant, use your meditate ability to generate extra Kenki and free meditation stacks. If you're entering the downtime with 2 Sen, try to make sure that they are Setsu and Ka from Yukikaze and Kasha. And the last tip is, it's almost always better to get your Madari out as soon as possible upon exiting downtime so that you can get your buffs reapplied. Some fights may have downtime that happens when your cooldowns are coming up, and your options are kind of 1 of 2 ways. Use it before the downtime segment, or use it after the downtime segment. Are you going to lose a usage by the end of the fight? And will you remain aligned with the party for the rest of the fight if you held or did not hold? Unfortunately, that decision may not always be clear. Our major 2-minute cooldowns and our dot Higenbana remaining aligned is important for raid damage, but losing an entire usage of your cooldowns is also a huge loss. So ideally, you remain aligned and don't lose the use of your cooldowns, or you remain aligned and have used cooldowns pre-downtime to gain a use by the end. To bring things back around, utilizing Miekyo can be a great way to manipulate your sequence, your rotation, or recover from downtime. And it's also the methodologies and principles that people use when they're spreadsheeting fights or doing what's called fillerless or ad hoc rotations. And these are the exact same principles that I use when I spreadsheet fights for speedruns. Ultimately, I will always push players into doing a standard loop, as it is the most applicable, efficient, and still effective rotation for all Samurai players, regardless of skill level. And I truly believe that understanding the fundamentals behind the loop allows you to flex your rotation to whatever the raid throws at you. At the end of the day, if you don't know your kill time, there's no way of knowing what the best rotation for that situation is. And if you're spreadsheeting a fight, you have to make the assumption that the boss is going to die at the exact same time every single time, thus rendering anything after the end of that rotation useless. So study the fight, learn the uptime strats, work on the fundamentals, understand the fundamentals, build a foundation for yourself. And unless you know exactly when the boss is going to die in whatever fight you're doing, the standard loop is where I would start. So I hope that you've all enjoyed this guide. I know that it was really long. I've never really made a video guide like this before. So please feel free to give me any feedback or comments. I would greatly appreciate it. This is something that a lot of people have been asking for a very long time. And it's really why I wanted to work on the Samurai guide for Dawntrail, because I wanted to make sure I structured the written guide and this video in a way that conveys the key concepts, hammers home the core concepts, and tries to bring everything together so that you can see the overall picture of what we're trying to do. I hope I was able to accomplish that. And if you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much. I'll have a link to my Discord server below, or it's just discord.gg/Tyci, where you can come hang out and chat Samurai and see pictures of the doggos. Or I've been streaming more on Twitch, which is also where I'll be streaming World Prog with my team SleepoCat. Feel free to shoot me any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for watching my video, and have a great rest of your day.